네, 2시부터 4시까지 3부 세션을 시작하도록 하겠습니다. 3부 세션은 유네스코 무형유산 협약에서의 관광에 대한 논의를 중심으로 해서 진행될 예정입니다. 좌장을 맡아주신 플린더스 대학교 길라드 주커만 교수님을 모시고 3부 세션을 이어가도록 하겠습니다. 길라드 주커만 교수님, 네, 부탁드리겠습니다.
Thank you. Sorry? Oh, disappeared. Oh, okay. This photo is from 2000 and... No, it's from the University of Queensland, where I met Amar Gala, who is here. It's a pleasure. I don't know how they found this photo. It's probably on the internet somewhere, but it's not the one that I provided. It's a great pleasure to be here in Jeonju, and especially sharing this beautiful session with 4 people whom I have met. Firstly, I would like to introduce the 4 people briefly, and then I would like to tell you what this session is about, very briefly. So the first presenter we are going to have is Joanne Orr. She has 35 years of experience in the realm of intangible cultural heritage. She has worked in Scotland, in Portugal, in Poland, and in many other countries. And she's going to be the first presenter, followed by a commentator who is the Director of Cooperation and Networking Office at ICCAP, which is the Intangible Cultural Heritage Center for Asia Pacific, which is headquartered here. And Cha Boyang, is going to be the commentator. Then, after questions from the audience, we are going to have a second presenter, Séverine Cachat. Séverine Cachat has a doctorate in cultural anthropology, and she has worked in the Center for Intangible Heritage, which is originally in Britain, but she was for 10 years in Paris, and now she's an independent consultant. And Séverine Cachat, she has a beautiful name because Cachat in Hebrew means severe or tough or hard or difficult, like Séverine. So Séverine Cachat is like hard, you know? And it's kind of ironic because she's very non-hard, you know? The commentator is going to be Jong Song-mi. Jong Song-mi is professor at the Korea National University of Heritage, and it's a great pleasure to have 2 presenters from Europe and 2 commentators from Korea. Why is it so much of a pleasure? Because we are going to discuss today the UNESCO Convention for Intangible Cultural Heritage and tourism. The and tourism should have a comma before, because somebody might think that the convention was also about tourism. It was not. The UNESCO Convention of ICH is a very complex, in my view, endeavor, because the main question is top-down versus bottom-up, but also universalism or universal guidelines versus cultural relativist ICH. So it has also morality and ethics involved, and therefore I'm very, very happy to be chairing this session. I would like to call upon Joanna Orr to start. Thank you, Joanna, for being here.
Hiding the water. hiding the water. Okay, I just want to say congratulations for a fantastic event. It's been a wonderful week, and I'm very, very happy and proud to be here. So congratulations to everybody involved in the organization and those providing the experiences, and to CICS for organizing all this and bringing us together to learn so much. So it's been fabulous. So, Ansadar and buenas tardes para español. Buenas tardes. Okay, my subject sounds quite dry, as we would say in English. Operational directives for implementing the convention and their implications for sustainable tourism. So I'm just going to start with a few slides with lots of text. It is in the book you've been provided, but it's worth just looking at this, because I always try and start with the articles of the convention. And if you haven't looked at the convention, please look online, UNESCO, and put basic texts, and you can learn very much around this convention and how it's implemented and operated. So Article 1 of the convention sets the tone and direction that ICH is to be safeguarded and respected, ensuring mutual appreciation thereof. Article 2 mentions intangible cultural heritage as linked to the requirement for sustainable development. So that's our context, so tourism within the context of sustainable development. For the purposes of the convention, consideration will be given solely to such intangible cultural heritage as is compatible with existing international human rights instruments, as well as with the requirements of mutual respect among communities, groups, and individuals, and of sustainable development. So again, this is our context of respect, mutual respect. So when entering into tourism within the ICH context, you must bear that in mind: mutual respect and human rights. So we move on then to Chapter 5. So this is a chapter dedicated around sustainable development. It came into being, I think it came in 2016, I think was the move to this additional chapter. So this is in the operational directives. So within the basic text, you have the articles, and you have a set of, they're called operational directives, but they're more a set of guidelines in how to implement the convention, guidelines for states parties, but also for practitioners, NGOs working in this field. They give us a feel for the general direction. And these basic texts, unlike I think a lot of other instruments and treaties around the world, is updated every 2 years, roughly 2 years. So we're really trying to give guidance on a contemporary basis that's relevant. So in the preamble, Chapter 5, it states, states parties will recognize the interdependence between the safeguarding of intangible cultural heritage and sustainable development. So there is that interdependence. Strive to maintain a balance between the 3 dimensions of sustainable development: the economic, social, and environmental, as well as their interdependence with peace and security. And these threads run throughout the guidance of the convention. The operational directive as a whole, as I say, it's aimed at the states parties as the implementer. So UNESCO works through the states parties. That's the way it's set up. NGOs, particularly through the NGO ICH Forum, can influence matters, and there is a real need for practitioners, civil society, to be connected to UNESCO in many ways to influence that future policy, so that there is more of a diverse view, because this convention has community at its heart. So it needs to take cognizance of that. On section 187, states parties shall endeavour to ensure that any activities related to tourism, I think this is about the only mention of tourism in the convention, whether undertaken by the state's parties or by public or private bodies demonstrate all due respect to the safeguarding of the intangible cultural heritage present in their territories and to the rights, aspirations, and wishes of the community groups and individuals concerned therewith. So again, a reminder, even from the state's parties, and we've heard many presentations today about tourism, particularly here. So it is that respect and to ensure that the ICH is safeguarded at all times. So that is a real responsibility. Okay. So that's the convention. So that's all it says in the operational directives and the articles. So there's not a lot else. I did look very carefully. But it does give us that direction of respect, community at the center, and balance between sustainable development and communities and the safeguarding of the ICH. So those three kind of elements. The other context is tourism. So despite COVID, it is growing, and the UN World Tourism Organization predicts a rise of 1.8 billion tourists by 2030, up from 1.5 million in 2019, so pre-COVID. So it is a massive global growing industry. But social media, there's a trend now of social media and that individuals that move from mass tourism that Robert referred to yesterday is concentrating tourism to hotspots. So Murmuration, a French startup company monitoring the environmental impact of tourism by satellite. A murmuration is a word for lots of birds moving together in English. An estimate 80% of travelers visit 10% of the world's destinations. So that, when we talk about over-tourism, that trend, and I know from personal experiences, lovely beaches where I live, it appears on TripAdvisor, #1 place, so my secret little beach is now full of people. So we've probably all experienced that through different forms of the social media platforms. So this is the impact of it, concentrating people. But we also have this trend of an increasing number of tourists. Not only do they want to experience the real food, the real people, experiential, but they also have, they're wanting responsibility, taking responsibility for their travel and want to travel more sustainably. So that is an emerging trend which thankfully will be hopefully good for everybody. So more responsible travel. So I'm going to turn through some photographs now and slides and talk through several examples of how in practice these overarching guidelines and articles and the UN World Tourism Organization, what it's setting out as trends, how we end up with balance and tensions within that. So this is an image from visitlatedistrict.com. So we're increasingly seeing destination management organizations tend to be your marketing base for a destination. So this is Visit Lake District that sits behind where there is a Lake District National Park. So the Lake District is a World Heritage Site. So it's an area in the north of England, on the west, of mountains, lakes, and its listing was really the picturesque, this picturesque idyll of Wordsworth wrote his poetry there, looking for his cloud of daffodils. Ruskin wrote about this peaceful idyll. So there is a tourism tradition here going back to the 18th century. But also in the World Heritage listing is the agro-pastoral tradition of the farmers, traditional sheep farming on the fells. These mountains are called fells. But this is a really small area because it's a series of narrow valleys with one road in, one road out. You don't go over the mountains. There's very little transport within that. Narrow roads. It's 2,362 square kilometers, which actually is not very big because you've got mountains all in the middle of it in terms of where you can go. But it gets 18.1 million visitors in this concentrated area, all wanting to access the mountains, the beauty, the peace. So it's highly, its proximity is quite close to various industrial cities in the north of England. So it's a day trip or maybe a couple of days to go walking. So, but in terms of the realities of this space, so you've got sheep farmers trying to carry out their traditions, and there are many traditions associated with this area, geographical area. Yan Tan, Mither and Tan is a way of counting sheep that is still used in the auctions. There's Cumbrian language, but the tourist isn't accessing that. But the imbalance, having lived there myself for a short time, as a resident and as a community living there, all of the services are directed to those visitors, the tourists. So your quality of life living there as a resident isn't great. And people move there because it's so beautiful, but actually it's not a great place. You can't access your bank, you know, in terms of basic services like the doctors, the hospital. There's nothing really there for the residents. And it can be a huge tension between, the other interesting factor around this is the national park. So this has been a national park, so the whole area with the villages in it as well as the mountains, so those resident communities is run by as a national park. One of the first, I think it was 1951, it was started in the UK. So you have a policy top-down dictating many aspects of how people live within this geographical area, which is beautiful. Look it up, it is a stunning place. And it has some aspects of that culture which are hugely popular. One of them you may recognize is Beatrix Potter, who was born and lived in the Lake District and wrote her Peter Rabbit. So this attracts, again, I don't know what percentage of the 18.11 million, but quite a lot, very popular. And we do get visitors for the other ICH elements of the heritage there, but less are well known, so people are practicing their ICH in the background. So one of them, I could only find an older photograph that I could use. So this is sheepdog trials. So I said the sheep and the traditions around the sheep farming on the mountains. You're going up high on the mountains, no roads. So you're using dogs to round up the sheep. So usually a traditional collie dog, not lassie, but similar to lassie. And these are still going on. So they're practiced in many villages in the area. Everybody gets together and you watch a dog round up sheep, and it's a competition. So that is a tradition that's still going on quietly, does attract a few tourists. It's a day out, but it's not reliant on the tourism interaction, but is very, local residents are very proud of it and will continue that tradition. It's doing well. Another one is rush bearing, which is related to Palm Sunday, so it's a religious connection that was revitalized at a later date, this one, but in sort of 19th century, but it's practiced, goes well. A few people, again, not tourism orientated, so the ICH isn't part of the offer. Things like Beatrix Potter, the mountains are, but the coexistence of the sheep farmers trying to practice, you know, to breed and, you know, farm sheep has to coexist because there's no fences on the mountains. There's footpaths and 18.1 million visitors using this land. So tensions can appear. And I know this because I've read the plans most recently. The tensions are only getting more extreme. So in terms of planning and new housing, attracting, well, getting retention of young people in the area, no one can afford to buy a house or rent a house in this area. They can't build. There's very little ability to build because of the World Heritage Site status and how far can the villages actually expand? So again, to live there, I was asked more recently to return, and I said no. It's a very difficult, there's no easy answer. You have many stakeholders. So the tourism business here is lots of small micro businesses, so small bed and breakfast, little restaurants, a mixture of that on the ground, and then big commercial chains, hotels, there are some of those. So there's a lot of money associated with the brand and with this area. But as we know, tourism is very fragile, and it can take one event to completely halt everything. And depending on the support there, whether that tourism can be restarted is another matter. So this is what happened to the Lake District. So I was resident working in a large regional museum on the border of this area at the Lake District. So in 2001, we had foot and mouth, which is a disease that attacks cattle and sheep, an outbreak. And the national park, with its concern of we don't want to spread it because there was a government, we're not spreading it, closed the whole area completely, shut us off completely. But with no funding, no support, tourism businesses were shut from day one, and all the animals were culled, they were killed and burned. And it was extremely traumatic for people, farmers who'd bred, these are cows but sheep, generations of award-winning, those herds of sheep, cows, everything were killed and burned. And they would call, so we, in our museum, most of the people working there they were connected to a farm, so we had the radio on every day, and they would call out the names of the farms, and people would have to go home, and that was them isolated, and it went on for nearly a year. So people were completely cut off. So it was like a practice for the pandemic, but absolutely no movement at all. And an outside imposition and no funding, no support, nothing. So in that time, all of the small tourism of the millions of visitors were completely cut off, stopped overnight. And I was on the Cumbria Tourist Board at the time, on the executive board. The national park didn't communicate with the tourist board, didn't communicate with the farmers, and just issued a media, we're closed. So that kind of impact. So from that high level of millions of visitors, it took 10 years for those businesses to recover. So you could go and buy property in this area after 2001. So it was a bit of a tough time, but a reminder of that fragility of the ecosystem of tourism industry. It's not faceless, it is reliant on people. I think one of our presenters, people is at the heart of it, and they're often the practitioners as well of the things, the traditions that are keeping an area going and a sense of identity. Lake District, people from the Lake District have a very strong sense of identity. So if there is that sudden edict, it can stop overnight. And I'm sure here in Korea, you've had that thought as well. More text, apologies. So in terms of tourism, we've got sustainable tourism, but we're now, the UN has produced these principles of regenerative tourism. So for us, in terms of the ICH, this is a much more alignment, much more aligned with ICH and its practice. So a holistic understanding of living systems approach. Now that might, the whole ecosystem, which is really what I was talking about before in that one example. Collaborative, so stimulating that collaboration between partners. You do need all these stakeholders and partners. We know when we're doing safeguarding plans for ICH, the number of stakeholders that need to be brought together if something is going to be safeguarded. Particularly if it's a product of some sort, like making the cheese. You know, you can have really conflicting stakeholder views on how this should happen, how it should be sold, how it should be merchandised, how it should be made. So collaborative and bringing people together. Diverse by nature. I think we've all agreed that ICH is incredibly diverse. That's one of its strengths. Inclusive and equitable. And going back to the principles at the start from the convention, the articles and the guidelines, this is pretty much central to the way we want to work and strive to work. Transformational and inspirational. I think the transformational side is, ICH isn't fixed. We know heritage transforms lives, but it's not fixed. It's living, and it's transmitted, and it's constantly changing. And it's constantly, I would say, inspirational in the right context. And environmentally responsible. And cultural stewardship, protection, local heritage traditions, and local people. So there's a mention here in a tourism principle of the traditions, local people who happen to be the best persons to take care of biodiversity, natural ecosystems, and thanks to their ancient wisdom, knowledge passed on from generation to generation. So here's a set of principles that is closely aligned with the convention and the way we're working and want to work in ICH. So we heard about this yesterday, the web dossier. So in doing research around this area and writing a chapter on sustainable ICH sustainability and tourism, I really struggled to find sources. There are key texts, there are key examples, but the web dossier had just been finished and absolutely fantastic as a resource to be able to use. And again, I would encourage you to have a look at it and just, browse through it. There's so many case studies, but also they've collected together resources that can be used in your thinking, how you're putting together a piece of work, project, article, essay. I know we've got some students here. And it collects together key policy documents, such as you've got the Istanbul Declaration of 2018, which was, the UNESCO and UNWTO doing a joint declaration together, raising awareness, ensuring mutual appreciation, strengthening decision-making powers of local communities, and establishing collaborative platforms. So these reoccurring themes in our key documents, key frameworks are moving to this language. And we talked before about ethical approaches, and I think these documents are really starting to capture it and pin it down. This is what we mean. So they're there, and I say, great that the web dossier has put these in there as resources for you to draw upon. So that's some of the overall context, and I'm going to go back now to some more examples. So I collected lots of case studies in order to produce a book on practitioner perspectives on intangible cultural heritage, which is really an introduction to the whole field. And I had the great honor of interviewing Mr. Chu Ngoy from Vietnam, who had done recently a collaboration with the British Council on safeguarding some of the weaving practices in a Cham village. So the master weavers were not connecting really with the younger generations, finding it hard in terms of passing on the traditions because many young people were leaving to earn more money in a factory. So there was that, the loss of the more complex weaving tradition patterns, but also creating income enough for people to want to stay. So this was a project that had these sort of key things of revitalizing some of the traditions, safeguarding the knowledge, and creating some sustainable income within the village area from tourism. So both domestic tourists and international tourists. And they really, the domestic tourists were very interested in just buying the simpler designs. So they really wanted to introduce the domestic tourists to some more complex weaving designs and what their meaning was. So they didn't want to just do plastic dolls and, this was the museum. So it was a cooperative center in the village that people would visit. So they wanted to do something a bit more interesting. So they commissioned the local pottery, and Mr. Chun Nogoi was extremely proud of this, that they had a collaboration with a traditional pottery nearby to make the figures to show the different costumes which then could be made. And one of the key outcomes of this project was that the 12 young apprentices all stayed in the village. They didn't go off to the factories because they could make a living and an income and stay within that geographical village. So it really safeguarded, but as I say, it was very much, they didn't know if it would have those kind of outcomes. They had the aspiration, but I just thought it was really nice that instead of just getting a doll, they commissioned their, a partnership with another ICH practice in the next village. And that kind of, I said, does it increase tourism? Is there any tensions? It's like, no. This has been a really positive outcome for us. We are getting more domestic. The international tourists we can demonstrate to, they're interested. But this little bit of interpretation really helps in terms of understanding and transmitting the knowledge to that wider audience. He was fantastic. So this is Dawson City. So we're moving now. It was Vietnam. We're now in Canada. So this is in Yukon, in the kind of north, not the Northwest Territories, but not too far from Alaska, in Canada. So this was where the Klondike happened, the gold rush. So you may have heard of the gold rush. You may have some heritage connected with the gold rush. It involved an awful lot of people and a massive migration of people. So I visited in 2019. So this is my experience from 2019. And I was reading that this whole area became a World Heritage Site in 2023. Last year it was listed. And it says it's from the nation, so there's obviously some movement. But at this stage, the interpretation was solely about the white settlers. It was very narrow. And this whole town, which is a working town, was fixed at the point, I think it's 1868 or something, of the Klondike. So it's all preserved, but people are still trying to use it as a town. So in terms of even the miners, the indigenous communities still living in the locality, this is their administrative center. So coming in, one indigenous lady said to me, our elders can't come in anymore because these boardwalks, they've got higher and higher as the buildings have sunk, but they won't do anything to change the buildings. They just make the boardwalks higher. So now people can't access basic administration. The interpretation, as said, is all about this Klondike. So in the background, that big white patch is the moose slide, which has huge importance in the local indigenous culture, the stories, and the traditions around it. And it did say in the listing that this was included and that there was now more of a First Nation direction around this. But at the time, it wasn't mentioned in any interpretation at all. And as I say, this is your guide in the town. And the impact on the indigenous communities of the Klondike, you can imagine, all these people coming, massive destruction of lands and appropriation of land culture. So it doesn't really reflect that. So I don't know if the interpretation has changed. And the World Heritage Site listing is very high level. So it'd be interesting to see if that makes any difference, the fact that it's driven by First Nation. And meeting quite a lot of emerging tourism, indigenous tourism businesses. I think I mentioned yesterday that where people are at in terms of sharing their ICH for tourism purposes, there were communities there saying, we're not ready. We know we're getting there and we're developing a tourism offer, but we're not ready to share it now. And there is a strong indigenous tourism presence in Canada. So there is the Yukon First Nations Culture and Tourism Association driving tourism thinking in terms of that balance of safeguarding and economic return for a tourism offer. And in a broader sense, British Columbia, which has 204 First Nations, different ones, and 34 languages, indigenous languages, has a very strong indigenous tourism presence. They have a very well-attended annual conference. So taking ownership of tourism from an indigenous perspective. The overall British Columbia tourism offer is supernatural. They're selling the landscape, the lakes, the mountains, the forests, a bit similar to New Zealand, which is 100% pure. You know, they're selling you a pure natural experience in New Zealand, even though you've flown on your aeroplane to get there because it's a really long way away. So there's a little bit of irony in there. And another community that has really taken ownership of their heritage from, I think the 1970s was when this has started. And they're another World Heritage, Haida Gwaii. So an archipelago islands on the west coast, very north, again, very close to Alaska, incredibly strong nation. So this is their heritage center, and they have, if you want to know a little bit about indigenizing collections, there is an incredible ICOM webinar that's available online on the this is Celinda Nye Saving Things House. So if you look up Saving Thing House and ICOM, you'll come across that webinar where they talk about how they safeguard the collections and in that museum, but still make them available for community to use, handle, and use in ceremonies. So the ICH meaning associated with these collections remains alive and well and thriving, to be honest. That was just another view. And in Victoria, the city itself on Vancouver Island, this is the Kwakwakiwak Meeting House. So this is, the museum and the heritage kind of interpretation in Victoria is on Coast Salish land. So they had a connection with Kwakwakiwak, built this meeting house and have a meeting place that they've made available for any nations visiting the city who don't have their place. So this is, although it's run by Kwakwakiwak, it's their place. But from a tourist perspective, you have this wonderful timber building in the middle of the city with poles around it, a park that people can enjoy. They can't go in unless they're invited. So you can look at it, but it's pretty amazing. Not sure how long I have. So we're moving country again. I've only got a few more. And this is Guatemala. I had a very quick visit, a Mayan World Heritage Site. This one's 1979. I looked at the listing, and it's about Mayan culture, ancient. It's like Mayan culture is not alive, and we know from these ladies here, Mayan culture is alive. So, but what you'll notice is that's a Mayan ceremony, a contemporary Mayan ceremony altar in this Tikal. So I don't know whether the park just lets it happen, but it certainly wasn't in the World Heritage listing. So there is a balance happening there where contemporary living Mayan practice is happening against this setting of the ancient culture. And everywhere I went in Guatemala, there was evidence that Maya is not just an ancient civilization, it's a living culture. So, and I'm sure we saw that yesterday, that it's alive and well. So last few slides now. So I know I'm taking a quick trip around the world. I'm going back to the UK. So this is one that I was talking with Xinhua, so it's his fault that this one's on the other night. So this is Blackpool, which is a seaside town on the west coast of England, famous for a Victorian seaside offer. So they did look at World Heritage Site possibilities, but I spoke to the lady looking at the nomination when they were doing it. She said, I'm really sorry, but so much is missing. You're seeing the 1894 tower, a roller coaster from 1935, the Grand National that's still there. It's terrifying. Not big, but, ooh, old. But next to this is the big one. It's a huge roller coaster. It's massive. So this site has new roller coasters, theme parks. It's a great place to take the kids. All that's happening. So you think, oh, you know, it's ruined as a heritage thing. But actually, talking to show people, traveling show people who do the fairs, so they may have the stalls where there are small stalls. They are taken as children to Blackpool to learn from the masters the craft of being in a fairground. So it still happens. And nobody, you wouldn't know any of that. It was only by chance. So the ICH behind this is alive and well. But you wouldn't think that from the big roller coaster, the big one. And a final, next one. So this is an example in Eastern Europe of regenerative tourism, of hosts buying a piece of land, building a 15-bedroom hotel, but also changing, putting paths in the landscape to provide a setting and a venue for local weddings. Because the community spend huge amounts of money on a wedding ceremony, and they're saying, we will give you this for free. We're building this, we want to share it with you. So that's somebody doing regenerative tourism. I think tourists are coming in, they're promoting that, they're putting something back into the community. Come and have your wedding, beautiful setting, our hotel, but you don't have to pay for it. And I'm just going back to Scotland now. I don't know if I went well. I'm going to Scotland. One other thing. So this is Outlander. I don't know if you've heard of Outlander. It's a very popular series, books, fantasy. But the outcome of this is people come to Scotland, find the locations of the castles, go all over Scotland, really looking for the story of Outlander. So it's had a huge boost in bringing tourists all over the country. But my point is, people believe it. So I was at Culloden Battlefield, which was a big battlefield. Everybody died from the Scots side. So they have markers of where clans, people were killed, gravestone. So there's one around the Fraser name. So the key character in this story is Jamie Fraser, and they've had to put a fence around it because so many people have gone to the graves thinking that it's him. So that, you know, when it becomes a tradition, and this series, the Gaelic language in this series is correct. They've made it so certain ICH elements have been reproduced for the show. They have the best experts. The Gaelic is Argyll and Bute Gaelic actually is perfect. So they've tried to put the traditions in, but when it is fantasy. So Culloden is overrun by people looking for Jamie Fraser's grave. So on that warning note.
Thank you so much. It was fascinating. I would like to ask Cha Bei Yang. Oh, you're the first one. Cha Bei Yang to join us. And we have here a parliament of owls. Here you can, not an embarrassment of pandas or a commemoration of French startups. Yeah, you can now speak there. And we will have a translation through the, so everybody please put your translation device. And what I suggest is that you speak first, then Joanna can answer, and then we will have some questions either now or after the next presentation. We'll see the time. Thank you. Please, Boyang.
Yes, correct. Thank you very much, Professor Gilad Jukaman. Actually, I was thinking, which language should I, speak in? But, as I was listening to Joanna's presentation, I was actually counting, the audience, how many Koreans and how many non-Koreans here. But I think it's the almost same. So I was, thinking to myself again, but as our chairperson, suggests, perhaps I can speak in Korean?
Whatever you prefer. I love Korean as much as I love English, except that if you speak in Korean, I will use our amazing translators. Thank you so much for the interpreters there. I haven't seen their faces, but they're hiding somewhere there. So it's your decision.
Right. Okay. 그럼 저는 한국말로 하겠습니다. Is that okay with you? I can speak in Korean. Right. 제가 오늘 아침에 갑자기 사무실에서 그 긴급 콜을 받아가지고 아침 그 모닝 세션을 놓쳤어요. 그래서 사실 어디로 올라가야 되나 이거부터 조금 제가 헷갈렸는데 제가 정신을 차리고 잘 토론을 해보도록 하겠습니다. 저희 조앤 오어 선생님께서 유네스코 무형유산 보호 협약 이행을 위한 운영 지침과 지속 가능한 무형유산 관광에 대한 시사점이라는 주제로 해서 발표를 해주셨습니다. 발표문은 협약 체제에서 무형유산과 관광에 대한 어떤 내용이 명시되어 있는지를 살펴보면서 시작을 하셨는데요. 그 발표자 선생님께서 지적한 바와 같이 협약의 조항 중에는 아주 직접적으로 무형유산과 관광이라는 그런 이제 관광을 직접적으로 다루고 있는 내용은 없습니다. 그런 이제 협약 조항은 없습니다. 이것은 협약이 국제 문서로서 무형유산 보호를 위한 기본적인 원칙과 그리고 방향성에 대한 내용들을 주로 담고 있기 때문인데요. 그렇기 때문에 협약 자체에는 이런 세부적인 내용에 대해서는 다루고 있지 않지만 별도로 운영 지침이라는 문서를 채택을 해서 그때그때 필요한 사항들을 더해가면서 협약의 이행을 증진하고 있습니다. 무형유산과 관광이라는 내용이 그 운영 지침상에 처음 나타나게 된 게 제 기억에는 그 선생님께서도 지적하셨지만 2015년도에 있었던 그 운영 지침의 개정에서 이루어진 걸로 보이는데요. 이때도 관광이라는 챕터라기보다는 무형유산과 지속가능한 발전과의 관계라는 챕터가 새로 추가되면서 거기에서 지속가능한 발전 방안으로서의 하나로 무형유산의 관광이 제시가 되었습니다. 그러니까 일부 내용을 지금 다루고 있고 여기서도 어떤 구체적인 방안을 제시한다기보다는요, 어떤 방향성이나 고려할 사항들에 대해서 제시하는 것으로 하고 있습니다. 근데 여기서 주목해야 할 것은 그래도 무형유산과 관광이라는 것의 상호 관계에 대해서 다루고 있다라는 내용인데요. 그간의 어떤 그 초기에 무형유산 보호 협약에서 어떤 상업화라든지 또는 상업화를 불러일으킬 만한 그런 측면에 대해서 조금 조심스러워하고 좀 아직은 뭐 이르다 이런 류의 그 토론들이 이루어졌다면 2015년도에 그 운영 지침에서 지속 가능한 발전이라는 챕터가 추가된 것은 무형유산이 단순히 보호를 받아야 하는 대상으로 끝나는 것이 아니라 무형유산을 통해서 무형유산을 이행하는 또는 향유하는 공동체가 지속적으로 발전할 수 있도록 그 공동체를 지원할 수 있는 하나의 수단으로서 무형유산도 역할을 해야 한다라는 것을 인정한 것으로 보기 때문에 중요하다라고 볼 수 있겠습니다. 무형유산을 보호를 한다라는 그 협약의 기본 원칙이 사실은 보호에 있기 때문에 협약의 경우 기본 원칙이 보호에 있기 때문에 그럼에도 불구하고 그 관광을 얘기할 때 사실 네거티브한 면들이 많이 강조가 됐던 것도 저희가 부정은 할 수 없는 것 같습니다. 그럼에도 불구하고 다시 말씀드리지만 2015년도의 운영 지침에서는 공동체의 삶을 영위하고 지속하는 데에 관광이 기여할 수 있다는 점과 그 과정에서 고려되어야 된 사항들을 명시하고 있기 때문에 중요하다고 볼 수 있는데요. 그 오인 선생님께서 지금 제시해 주신 뭐 이스탄불 선언이라든지 또는 유엔의 관광 선언문 같은 곳에서도 어떤 하나의 대상으로서의 전통 문화나 또는 관광을 다루는 것이 아니라 그 공동체라는 사람이 중심인 거죠. 사람을 대상으로 하는 그것을 둘러싸고 있는 모든 환경이라든지 이제 좀 전체적인 측면에서의 부분으로 관광을 다루고 있다는 것이 중요하다고 생각이 됩니다. 제가 이제 관광이라는 관광 포럼을 이제 초대를 받으면서 조금 조심스러웠던 부분들이 관광을 얘기할 때 특히 문화 관광 또는 뭐 문화유산 관광 이렇게 얘기를 할 때 그 탈맥락화라든지 또는 과잉 관광 이 부분에 대한 그런 그 비판들이 사실 많이 있습니다. 실제로 그러한 이제 예시들을 저희가 어렵지 않게 주변에서도 볼 수 있고 그러한 우려들이 있다는 것을 알고 있는데 그럼에도 불구하고 어떤 상호 존중의 측면에서 우리가 무형유산과 관광을 이제는 좀 더 심도 있게 봐야 되지 않겠느냐 라는 그런 측면에서 이번 포럼도 기획이 되지 않았을까라는 생각이 듭니다. 그래서 이 상호 존중이라는 그 원칙에서 대원칙에서 협약이 보고 있는 무형유산의 보호와 그리고 실제로 그 공동체의 지속 가능한 발전과의 그런 관계들을 어떻게 우리가 조금 더 긍정적으로 만들 수 있겠는가 이런 것들을 좀 고민할 수 있는 기회가 되었던 것 같습니다. 제가 발표문 준비하면서 사실 이런저런 생각들을 좀 정리를 하면서 앞부분을 보냈는데요. 그 마무리는 시간이 많지 않은 관계로 제가 몇 가지 질문을 준비를 사실 했습니다. 근데 우리 오현 선생님께서 발표를 많이 해주시면서 사실 제가 그 사례를 조금 더 자세히 설명을 해주셨으면 좋겠다라는 질문을 준비를 했었는데 사실 제가 받았던 페이퍼보다 더 많은 사례를 오늘 발표를 해주셨어요. 그래서 뭐 영국의 뭐 국립공원 사례라든지 아니면 뭐 과테말라의 얘기라든지 베트남이라든지 이런 것들에 대해서는 사례를 더 많이 말씀을 해주셔서 그 사례에 대한 추가 설명은 넘어가도록 하고요. 대신 그 베트남 선생님의 인터뷰 부분은 제가 좀 인상적이었던 것이 그러니까 제가 발표문으로 이렇게 추측해 보건데 그러한 이제 본인의 어떤 공예라든지 이런 것들이 이제 잘 현대적으로 잘 이용되고 관광에 이용됨으로 인해서 오히려 더 긍정적인 그런 영향을 더 많이 받았다 해서 만족스러워하신다라는 느낌을 받았거든요. 네, 그 어떻게 그럴 수 있는지 다른 곳과의 차이점이 혹시 뭐가 있었는지에 대해서 좀 추가 설명을 해주시면 감사하겠고요. 마지막으로 그 오퍼레이셔널 다이렉티브스가 이제 채택된 지그 서스테이너블 디벨롭먼트 챕터가 채택이 된 지 내년으로 이제 10년이 되는데 이 10년의 기간 동안에 어떤 변화가 있었을 것 같고 또는 앞으로의 10년을 보면서 이 오퍼레이셔널 다이렉티브스가 그 개정이 다시 된다면 이러한 면들은 좀 추가가 내용이 됐으면 좋겠다라는 내용이 있으시면은 같이 설명을 해주시면은 감사하겠습니다. 고맙습니다.
Okay, right on. So the Vietnam project was an amazing opportunity for me to interview directly with a translator, but it was part of a British Council-funded project for a digital heritage collection. So they had been working with communities across, a lot of them were Cham community, to create a digital heritage platform. So they were asking communities to put forward their heritage to be digitized. So the communities were deciding and actually be facilitated, people coming in recording. So that's how I kind of met the weaver in terms of working around a digitization. So that's quite a big step when a community says, right, we'll put it on the record, we'll want the photographs, we want the recordings, we'll get our Cham language translated into Vietnamese, English, and so that opening and sharing. And this small project came as a next stage from the initial recording of the heritage and the nuances and discussion with community about what the key issues. So it really was a project of collaboration with the British Council providing some funding, but actually listening. So British Council Vietnam, this crafting of the digital heritage collection was considered, careful, step by stage. I'm not sure if it's actually up there yet. They're still working on it to some extent. So there was all that work first, and I think that in terms of building relationships and also understanding what some of the key issues were. But the master weaver was very clear about what of the outcomes he was looking for. So that beforehand, before entering into the project. But they also had to have a bit of capacity building because they hadn't managed a project, funding and the resources. So they did that first. So there was preparation, and it was a really positive experience for everybody involved, and their key goals they were looking for were fulfilled.
One more. I think it's about the ownership. You actually, acknowledge their ownership of their traditional culture. But wasn't there any obstacles or real resistance? Because British Council is the foreign authority to the
Absolutely.
Vietnamese, right?
But it was British Council Vietnam. So they had done, again, even before this project, there was a pilot project, Cultural Heritage for Inclusive Growth. So it was a 2-year pilot project. So Vietnam was one of the pilots, Colombia and Kenya, and it was about creating a methodology of working with practitioners, usually with a product to go to market, but cutting out the middleman. So creating empowering community to market their own product, to gain the income from it. So all of that was done beforehand, and this community was part of that project. So, and that methodology is now part of their, so British Council, but this project is a fantastic cultural heritage for inclusive growth. And it is what it is. So in the Bogota Intergovernmental Committee in 2019, there was a market over the road. So the project from Colombia, all the practitioners had market stalls. They'd come from the Amazon, the Andes, from their communities, first time traveling into, and it was a really positive experience. They sold, they were very happy to be there. So packaging on their products, they really got benefits with the tradition. So this is made because of this, and this is the tradition associated to explaining the ICH. So this weaving tradition had experience of that, so they had clear vision of their ownership. So, and sustainable development 10 years on, I think the momentum is gathering because although it was created 2015, it was Namibia, I've forgotten, there was nervousness around it. So, and there's been the recent meeting on the economic aspects that was presented last year at Kasane. So there was no discussion. So the expert meeting met, but there was no discussion at Kasane. So I think it's baby steps, we would say, small steps. So a little bit more confidence that actually, it's okay to earn your living from your tradition, but still a lot of how you do it, how much you earn, there's still a little bit of nervousness around it. So I think it will continue, but quite carefully.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Joanne and Boyang. And is there anybody with a question? How about you write down a question for either Joanne or Boyang, but in the meantime, we are going to ask Séverine Kasha to come and deliver her own lecture, which is going to be followed by the commentator Song Mi, is it? Song Mi, Jong Song Mi. And thank you, Séverine.
안녕하세요. Finally, after 2 days, after 1 week. So I'd like to express my deepest and heartfelt thanks to our hosts, the city of Jeonju and its people, and of course the CICS, especially Hani Han and Xinhua Han, but also the whole team, the whole wonderful team. beyond the perfect organization, you really know how to welcome your guests, really. I'm very honored to be the last speaker. So many things have already been said during these 2 days. So I will not develop all my slides, although there might have new audiences in the room. And anyway, my presentation can serve as a kind of wrap-up. So, the relationship between ICH and tourism is a complex one. I think this could be the conclusion of this forum. So I'm afraid I will have to read a little bit my presentation. Thank you. Because I'm not as comfortable as my Francophone colleague Léonce, contrary to what he says. So questioning the conditions or even the possibility of a sustainable tourism linked to ICH generally raises very contrasted reactions from enthusiasm, idealism to skepticism. So as an independent consultant, I've been involved in a few tourism projects. And after I left, this accredited NGO, the World Culture, the House of the World Culture, and also French Center for ICH, I remained part of this research working group of the ICH NGO Forum that has developed the web dossier. So this presentation is based on concrete experiences in the field and discussions with various stakeholders. So we will very briefly recall some of the synergies and challenges of interactions between communities and tourism actors, stressing the importance of collaboration. And we will revisit some key guidelines that can be helpful to navigate the complexities of negotiations with the various partners involved. So I'm not going to repeat what has just been said by Joanne about tourism and the 2003 convention and its operational directives. Just to mention that, of course, before the convention, there were many tourism projects integrating ICH practices, even if these were not identified or called as such, typically within the ethical tourism movement. But as in the early years of the convention, ICH-focused tourism projects seemed quite limited, often led by NGOs. So 20 years later, the landscape has changed significantly. Now living heritage is featured in various tourism development initiatives. So of course, this reflects the success of the convention and the efforts to raise awareness of the importance of ICH. But tourism itself has also been a kind of catalyst for ICH awareness. Living heritage has attracted new economic players and political decision makers. And tourism has been a driver in this growing interest. So there was a shift in both the scale and the stakeholders involved. There are now, for example, public contracts seeking to integrate, to develop tourism strategies that integrate various forms of heritage, natural, tangible, and intangible. One of the many examples could be Alula in Saudi Arabia, that you can see on this picture. So it's an ancient oasis and a former city of the Nabatean civilization, like Petra in Jordan, that you may know. So it's becoming a new major international tourist destination, still under development, by highlighting both its natural, archaeological, and living heritage, as well as its creative industries. Other initiatives aim to promote tourism in peripheral territories based on ICH, as mentioned by Robert yesterday. So to cite just one example, among many, the European project called Beyond the Beach, that has been launched recently last year, aims to support the inclusion of rural and island youth through the enhancement of ICH. The partners of this project are located in some of the most popular tourist areas: Lefkas in Greece, Marie-Galante in Guadeloupe, and Mayotte, two French overseas departments, one in the Caribbean and the other one in the Indian Ocean. So I will come back later to this example. So these strategies aim not only to renew and to diversify tourist offerings in popular destinations, but also to introduce new destinations. Sorry, Martin, I didn't ask for your permission, so the interaction between ICH communities and tourism stakeholders can be mutually beneficial, as it has been reminded. You have here a Colombian tourist enjoying an ICH tour in Kazane, Botswana. So, as Robert recalled again yesterday, travelers increasingly seek immersive experiences with music, local festivals and traditions, and to engage with the host communities. So, tourism can offer new audiences for performing arts, new customers for craft products, and this can lead to improved livelihoods as creative local businesses emerge and thrive. But beyond the economic benefits, tourist interest can help ICH gain new respect and recognition, particularly among young generations. These interactions foster cultural understanding and can support the transmission of heritage skills. For instance, young people may receive training in traditional building practices or crafts or performing arts. So in other words, when well-designed and managed, tourism activities can benefit local communities by increasing the economic, the social, and the cultural value of ICH. A case in point is the Tocati International Festival of Traditional Games and Sports in Verona, Italy, that is introduced in the web dossier of the ICH NGO Forum. It was selected for the Register of Good Safeguarding Practices of the 2003 Convention, submitted by Italy, Belgium, Croatia, Cyprus, and France. So just like the Batana Ecomuseum project presented yesterday by Tamara. So this festival turns urban and tourist areas into inclusive spaces. And I find it really interesting because one of its objectives is to empower communities to secure access to public spaces and to manage public spaces, which is a main issue in touristic towns. Of course, despite its potential benefits, tourism poses significant threats to ICH if not managed appropriately with the local communities. I'm not going to develop again these risks that include phrasing of ICH, decontextualization, loss of function and meaning, and so on, and also the pressure on natural environments. So mitigating these risks requires, of course, strategic planning, and it requires open discussions among all the stakeholders involved. However, as Tamara recalled yesterday, this is possible only if the stakeholders involved respect and appreciate each other's values. So the challenges kind of multiply in large-scale tourism projects that involve diverse partners with different backgrounds and different interests. While at the same time, these large-scale projects offer great potential in terms of impact and in terms of funding, they must be approached with caution because common pitfalls arise when projects are not developed first and foremost for and with the communities, which is often the case in large-scale projects. So when projects attempt to integrate various forms of heritage, we need to be very cautious and avoid that ICH is treated as secondary or even completely misunderstood. These projects are highly valuable because they offer the opportunity to explore collaboration within multidisciplinary teams and synergies between the UNESCO conventions. The adoption of the 2003 convention, as you know, has influenced the implementation of the 72 conventions, so the World Heritage Convention, and the recognition of the roles of the communities in the conservation of material heritage. Yet, ICH is still sometimes and inappropriately seen, understood as the stories behind the objects, the stories behind the sites or the monuments, and merely adding value to them. So this approach risks reducing ICH to a tool for building and promoting a tourist destination, while on the contrary, it needs to be fully recognized as a set of valuable and distinct cultural practices. Another risk may lie in a maybe too optimistic and utilitarian vision of living heritage, which may overestimate its economic potential as a lever for regional development through tourism. In the project Beyond the Beach that I previously mentioned, ICH appears as a reservoir of untapped job opportunities for the young needs, not in education, employment, or training. Because these island regions are home to a young population that is heavily affected by unemployment. However, the equation might not be so simple. Anyway, sustainable development is not only about income generation and job creation, but community well-being, social cohesion, and so on. These benefits are not always measurable in terms of by standard economic indicators. Yet, economic and political stakeholders often prioritize tangible returns on investment and visible results. So ICH becomes a field of intense negotiations when different stakeholders with competing interests are involved, and especially with commercial interests. While the economic dimension is crucial, it is also vital to ensure that commercial interests do not take precedence over cultural significance, as it has been reminded by several speakers. So to address these challenges, several guidelines and tools are now available that can help to anticipate these issues or to address or to correct their effects. Martin recalled yesterday there is no single recipe to guarantee a sustainable tourism based on ICH, but only specific cases. In the same way, there is not a single recipe for safeguarding living heritage, but tailored measures to address specific needs and threats to specific ICH elements. However, these resources can serve as a kind of compass to guide stakeholders during negotiations and try to ensure that tourism development remain beneficial to the communities. Among them, the ethical principles for safeguarding ICH endorsed by the Intergovernmental Committee in 2015, they provide a very basic framework. They emphasize the empowerment of communities in safeguarding activities, including, of course, tourism development. Principle 4, for example, calls for transparent collaboration, dialogue, negotiation, and consultation with ICH communities. Another resource is the guidance note on the economic dimension of ICH that has been drafted after several expert meetings and presented last year to the Intergovernmental Committee as part of the thematic initiatives on sustainable development under the 2003 Convention. This note advocates for a flexible, heritage-sensitive and rights-based approach to inclusive planning and management of the economic dimensions of ICH and its safeguarding. And this, of course, applies to tourism activities. And finally, again, the web dossier on ICH and sustainable tourism developed by the ICH NGO Forum offers some practical advice to design and to implement projects drawing on global experience and best practices. So among the strategies highlighted to mitigate the negative impacts of tourism without losing its benefits are some of the following. First, community-led tourism development. It is about ensuring that people have control over how their ICH is presented and used in tourism, and ensuring that making decisions are aligned with their values and priorities. Second, participatory planning and management involves engaging community members in the decision-making process to ensure that tourism initiatives align with the needs and aspirations of the communities. Capacity building and education, it's crucial to provide communities with the knowledge and skills they need to manage tourism initiatives, but education also raises awareness among tourists about the importance of respecting and safeguarding living heritage. Ethical and heritage-sensitive marketing involves presenting living heritage in a way that corresponds to its context and meaning and avoiding stereotypes. But it also includes providing tourists with guidelines for behavior, promoting cultural sensitivity and encouraging support for local initiatives that contribute to safeguard living heritage. And finally, monitoring and evaluation. Assessing the impact of tourism on living heritage allows to identify potential issues, such as the exclusion of community members from decision-making process, and to make the necessary adjustments. So this offers a solid framework for integrating ICH and tourism. But is a sustainable tourism based on living heritage really achievable? Well, first, sustainable tourism suggests a balanced approach that respects intangible cultural heritage, supports local communities, and minimizes environmental impact. However, the realities of the tourism industry often conflict with these ideals, because these realities are driven by profit, market demand, and global competition. Secondly, sustainability can vary quite significantly depending on the perspectives of different stakeholders involved. For the communities, it might mean safeguarding cultural practices and ensuring that tourism does not disrupt their way of life. Whereas for tourism operators, it might mean creating a profitable business that attracts visitors year-round. So these different interpretations of sustainability can lead to conflicting priorities. And third, the impact of mass tourism, mentioned yesterday by Robert, even tourism projects with the best intentions can contribute to creating many problems if they are not scaled to the capacity of the community. And this morning, Dr. Ryu mentioned this fire-based festival that is inscribed on the representative list since 2015. And I think it's a good example of, not a bad example, but of the complexities of management of tourism related to ICH, and especially ICH, which is inscribed on the UNESCO list. Because this festival happens normally every year on the 23rd of June in different localities in the Pyrenees Mountains, so both in Spain, France, and Andorra. Andorra is a very small country between France and Spain. And it's managed quite differently depending on the communities. But to give you some examples of bad managed of places, localities where it's not as well managed as it should be. In France, for example, in one locality, the local authorities have changed the date of the festival so that it happens on a Saturday night to attract more visitors and tourists, which does not respect the ritual, of course. And in Spain, in some localities and villages, because basically there are villages, it became so popular after it was inscribed on the UNESCO list that some of the young people, instead of practicing learning and practicing the ritual, they are busy by managing the parkings for the cars. So, you know, there is a risk of a lack of transmission, and some young people, because not all of the localities are part of the UNESCO list, so some young people living in localities that are part of the UNESCO file, they just leave the village and go to attend the ritual in another village to escape the crowds of tourists. Because it's absolutely not scaled to the capacity of the community. So, as a conclusion, sustainable tourism linked to ICH is fraught with contradictions. It requires a careful and nuanced approach that considers the needs and the perspectives of all stakeholders, but particularly of the communities whose heritage is at stake. It requires constant reflection and adaptation, because it is not enough to establish a project and assume that it will remain sustainable in the future. Because the dynamics of tourism, as well as the dynamics of ICH, are ever-changing, and what is sustainable today may not be sustainable tomorrow. I thank you for your attention. I've been very fast, so I think this leaves more time for the questions and exchanges. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Séverine. And for this fascinating presentation, I would like to ask Jong Song-mi, Professor of Korea National University of Heritage, to give us some comments. Professor Jong is going to speak in Korean, so if you have the device, please put it in your ear. And after that, we'll have questions from the audience. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's an honor to be here.
Out of all the people who have called my name, I can absolutely say that Chair Gilad Zuckerman pronunciation is the best. Okay, thank you. Thank you also for your insightful presentation. I truly appreciate the depth of analysis you've brought to the topic of intangible cultural heritage tourism. It's a privilege to engage in a discussion on such an important subject. I'd like to highlight a few key points from your presentation that I found particularly thought-provoking before moving on to some question and further discussion. This presentation paper provides a multifaceted analysis of the interaction between intangible cultural heritage and tourism, clearly explaining the complex relationship between the two areas. The presenter highlights the potential of tourism to generate economic benefits and protect intangible heritage, emphasizing the need for sustainable tourism development. In particular, it underscored the point that active participation of local communities in the tourism development process can prevent the commercialization and distortion of intangible heritage. This conveys an essential message that tourism should evolve beyond merely a tool for economic profit to one that preserves cultural values and protects the rights of local communities. The content of this presentation can be connected to the case of Jeju Island, a successful model of sustainable tourism in Korea. Jeju Island is an exemplary case of generating economic benefits while protecting intangible heritage and natural resources. Jeju has developed in its tourism industry and introduced an ecotourism model that strengthens cooperation with the local community by preserving its natural environment, designated as a UNESCO World Natural Heritage Site. For example, Hallasan Natural Park protects its ecosystem through visitors' limits and environmental education, while residents link strict environmental protector regulation are enforced at major tourist sites like Seongwangsan Ilchulbong. Residents link traditional culture and agricultural products with tourism, enjoying economic benefits while contributing to environmental conservation activities. The Jeju Haenyeo Experience program offers tourists a unique opportunity to engage directly with traditional Haenyeo culture, contributing to safeguarding intangible heritage. Through activities such as theatrical performance centered on the lives of the Haenyeo and conservation with elderly Haenyeo, these women's pride and cultural identity are conveyed directly to visitors. As a result, tourists gain a deeper understanding and respect for the authenticity of intangible heritage and the local community's culture. In conclusion, the relation between intangible heritage and tourism is a double-edged sword. While intangible heritage can be utilized as a tourism resource, it is crucial to maintain its inherent meaning and authenticity, ensuring that the voice of the local community and the bearer of the tradition are reflected in the design of sustainable tourism. When the balance in maintained intangible heritage and tourism can develop it into a mutually beneficial model. Several discussion points should be raised to develop deeper in the complex relation between intangible heritage and tourism. Now, I'd like to address 5 critical topics through my questions. What practical measures can prevent cultural distortion when intangible heritage is utilized as a tourism resource? How can the risk of intangible heritage becoming commercialized and distorted during its use as a tourism resource be managed?
what practical measures can the local community and the tourism industry implement to preserve the authenticity of intangible heritage and minimize ethical conflicts? In introducing representative models of or case studies of successful collaboration would be helpful. And how can the balance between the tourism industry's commercial benefits and the authenticity of intangible heritage be maintained? There is a risk of conflict between the pursuit of commercial profit and the preservation of the authenticity of intangible heritage during its commodification by the tourism industry. How can we establish concentrate management strategies and ethical standards to ensure that the intrinsic value of intangible heritage is not compromised while pursuing economic benefits? In particular, it is essential to explore how cooperation with local communities can prevent distortion caused by commercialization. How can the expertise of intangible heritage mediators impact the protection of intangible heritage and tourism industry? How intangible heritage mediators are crucial in understanding intangible heritage historical and cultural context and conveying it in tourist and the local community. How can their expertise contribute to protecting the authenticity of intangible heritage? And how can it be used to promote mutual respect between the tourism industry and intangible heritage? What are the most effective methods for evaluating tourism short-term and long-term impacts on intangible heritage? What tools or methodologies can be used to assess tourism short-term and long-term effects on intangible heritage? In the short term, we need ways to assess economic success, cultural sustainability, community well-being, and the preservation of traditional practice. In the long term, evaluation indicators that consider the preservation of authenticity and the sustainability of traditions are crucial. It is also essential to consider whether these indicators can be applied as standardized measures or should be adapted flexibly to the local context. What is the role of tourists as ethical consumers in tourism development aimed at protecting and transmitting intangible heritage? The presentation emphasized that community participation is crucial for preserving the authenticity of intangible heritage. In addition, I believe tourists also have an essential role to play as active participation. How can tourists contribute as ethical consumers who support the protection and transmission of intangible heritage rather than being mere consumers? How can tourists engage positively with local communities? I'm curious about what specific strategies could encourage such participation. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Wow, many questions. So if I try to summarize, your main point would be what are the practical measures that can be taken to prevent all the risks mentioned? I'm sorry, I think I will disappoint you. Because again, and actually this is why I titled my presentation A Compass to Navigate Negotiations, because again, of course, you have these basic principles to bear in mind in all projects and throughout the projects and after the project. You have these various tools that can guide you. For instance, the web dossier of the ICH NGO Forum includes first step to actions. And again, it is exactly the same as for safeguarding ICH in general. There is not one single recipe that can work for all ICH. If you think about the carpets from Azerbaijan or the intangible heritage from the communities in Mexico that we have seen, the needs and the risks are different, so you really have to tailor the measures to be adapted to these specific cases. So then, of course, it's more about, your question would be more about participatory methodologies. And again, that needs to be adapted to each specific case. Because it's not the same. For example, you asked how to tailor monitoring and evaluation. So it really depends on the community, because you will not proceed the same way, for example, in Europe or in communities, I don't know, in Africa or elsewhere, with very different backgrounds. We mentioned the importance of case studies. So yes, definitely, it is about combining these principles, these advices that you can find in these tools, and also case studies that you have available in some of these tools to adapt your own context. And you recall the importance of the mediators, the cultural brokers, let's say. And I think we have several among us, like members of the NGOs, most of the time act as cultural brokers. And yes, indeed, they play a crucial role in tailoring these measures to the needs of the communities, because they know the communities. And you mentioned also the role of the consumers, which is essential, and the tourists need also to be educated, and this can be done through different processes, but it is as much as important as to build the capacity of the communities. And also this can be done through this ethical marketing that raise the attention of the tourists of the way to behave on initiatives that foster the safeguarding of the living heritage. So yes, to summarize, I'm very sorry to have to disappoint you, but really it's a matter of adapting the participatory methodologies and these tools and this principle to the specific cases.
I appreciate your insights into the long-term sustainability of intangible cultural heritage through tourism. I'm curious about how we can measure success beyond economic metric. Measure success beyond economic metrics. For instance, how do we assess whether tourism has truly contribute to the intergenerational transmission of intangible heritage? There are specific cultural indicators or community feedback system that could be utilized.
I think also the indicators should be tailored to the situation, because again, it's not about the standard economic indicators, you know. So even, I would say that even the indicators should be negotiated with the community also. And also what is important is to assess at different stages, meaning at the beginning and in the course of the project and after the project, to be able to take the necessary measures. So again, maybe there are people in the room that have more background with the economic indicators, but again, I'm not sure that we can. You would in any case have to adapt to the situation. Definitely.
Thank you for your thoughtful response.
Thank you so much. I would like to thank you so much, Song-mi, as well. I would like to call upon Joanne to join us here, and then to ask the audience if you have questions for either Joanne or for Séverine. Thank you so much. If you don't have a question, I will have to ask a question. So we have one from Robert. Any more questions? One from Semina. Any more questions? Please don't be shy. So we will start with Semina. Yeah, Semina. You would like to ask a question? Yeah. You can use if you want, yeah. 1, 2, 3.
네, 두 분 발표 잘 들었습니다. 저는 지금 그 무형유산과 관광을 이 대학교 학생들한테 이제 좀 전달하는 개론서 작업을 좀 진행을 하고 있습니다. 그래서 두 분께서 다양한 사례들을 제시를 해주셨는데 저희 그 한국에 있는 무형유산을 전공하는 대학원생들에게 또는 대학생들에게 꼭 사례 이렇게 소개하고 싶은 잘된 모범 사례, 관광화가 잘 되어 있는 그런 사례들을 좀 추천해 주시면 감사하겠습니다.
Thank you. So, are there any cases that you recommend, Professor Semina, from CB&U, who very beautifully hosted me? I delivered a lecture to her students. Are there any cases that you believe that she should showcase to her students?
Are you thinking international or Korea?
International.
International. It depends on the subject area. There is quite a lot of material on the UNESCO website for case studies of good safeguarding practices, the list. So there is potential for making case studies around that. And say it's so wide and moving so quickly. So I think that's the other thing, is perhaps looking at your case studies for as contemporary as you can, or if you use an older one that you're showing, like Séverine did 20 years ago and now today, what are the changes? The case study can be anything. So a lot of my examples were not necessarily cases that are on the representative list or any of the lists. So it's really, even in your own experience or asking your students of their experience so that they can say back to you their understanding, and it's a check then against some of the documents and some of the resources and guidelines that we have mentioned.
Yeah, I agree with Joanne. It really depends on what you want to explain and to demonstrate. I have in mind two examples. One is the fest nose that was mentioned this morning. This traditional gathering and festival in the western part of France, which has been inscribed on the representative list as well. And it is it's a very good example in terms of participatory methodology and bottom-up approach promoted by the convention, because the initiative really comes from the communities. And I think it's an interesting case because the leader of an NGO, it's an accredited NGO by the way now, heard about the convention and understood really its potential in terms of, he is an actor of the traditional dances and music. And he understood the potential of the convention in terms of renewal of the discourse on traditional dances, because suddenly there is an international instrument that speaks about them. This is how he expresses how we met with the convention. And they organized, so two NGOs, they organized a meeting. I think it was as early as 2009. So even before the French government, it has ratified the convention, but in 2009, nothing happened. They had just started the national inventory, but it was very basic. So they had a meeting in Brittany with 200 people, like coming from nowhere. They were like very surprised by the success. So they decided, okay, we have to go on. Something is happening. We don't know yet what, but something is happening. So first, they decided they didn't want to nominate an element because they were thinking, what is the interest for us of nominating something on lists? So their first action was a call addressed to all local politics to raise awareness and to recognize ICH. And it worked pretty well. I mean, they had like, I don't remember, hundreds of signatures. And then finally, they thought, okay, so maybe this nomination process is interesting in itself. And it was not about Fest-Noz at the beginning, but to inscribe something. And Fest-Noz was perfect because, you know, there are several different dances and musics and groups that can be in competition. But Fest-Noz is very consensual because it brings everybody together. It's not a specific dance, it's traditional dances. And you also have the musicians and the organizers. So basically, not all the people in Brittany will attend Fest-Noz, but you would hardly find someone who is against Fest-Noz, basically. So, you know, it was a way really to gather different people that would have never spoken, work together without this dynamic of a nomination. And okay, I'm not going to, because I can talk about it for hours, but just to say that it was a very virtuous cycle, and it really worked very well, and I'm not aware of any kind of negative impact of the inscription of the Fest-Noz. And so this is a very good example of a bottom-up approach. And another example I have in mind, but it's not inscribed on the UNESCO list, it's registered in the French inventory, so it's, do I have time? No, okay. There was actually a photo in my very first slide in Reunion Island, and it's performing art that originates from India, because in Reunion Island you have people that come from different parts of the world, including India. And it has, nowadays, there are only 2 associations still practicing, because it's a long time to be trained, basically, as a master. So there are only maybe 3 masters left. And so the initiative came from the regional government. They had a capacity building with various local stakeholders, and including museums. And one of the museums is located in an area with many people of Indian origin. So they started this process of a participatory inventory, and it's just incredible how it worked because it raised awareness. Many, many people in Reunion Island, they had barely heard about this practice. They would have never been there. And with the inscription on it's only the French inventory, but they were invited to the television, to the radio, and even there was then an exhibition in this museum, which is quite big museum, with performances. So it's really interesting, and I think it's a good example of, yes, the positive impact on this kind of virtual cycle in terms of safeguarding.
Thank you, Séverine. I would like just to say a small comment to Semina before we move to Robert, because it will actually lead me to Robert, because Robert is going to ask us the next question. I think that from what I saw before several days ago about your students, they're very thirsty for critical thinking. If I were you, I would give them a scenario. So, for example, you go to a temple in Bali and you show the dance, and then you ask them, what do you think about it? Then you go to a touristic place where the dancers, the Balinese dancers, are paid a lot of money, or the tourists pay a lot of money to see them dancing, and then you ask the students, what do you think? And they say, oh, that's horrific. I mean, it's kind of commercialization. And then, as Robert mentioned yesterday, as Michel Picard in 1990, you take them to a Balinese temple, your students, and you show them another dance, and then you tell them, actually, you know what? This dance was devised within the touristic industry. And then it went back to the Balinese temple. And then, oh, really? I mean, so is it good or is it bad? You know, so I think that this is a very good case study because it kind of, you know, like changes the way that people are trajectory to think, you know. This leads me to Robert. Robert has a question.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Séverine and Joanne, for nuanced presentations that really dealt with complexities of tourism in a really critical way. Séverine, you'd asked about economic indicators. Within the arts and heritage, the most common economic indicator, which was mentioned by Léonce earlier today, is the multiplier effect. So you spend a certain amount of money, or every dollar you spent on tourism or the arts or whatever is multiplied because people stay in hotels or they buy meals, etc. Now, there are some within the arts. There have been some other notions of economic indicators that the arts makes people want to relocate to an area and makes it more attractive. And you know, when you have the convergence, I would say of a destination which is, as you both showed, that's happy and comfortable and stimulating for both tourists and residents, then that boosts the economy. But I also wanted, if I could, just to mention some other things about economics of ICH and tourism. I have to say I was surprised that in the economic dimensions of ICH report and the study there were no heritage economists involved in it. And the most prominent heritage economist, David Throsby, speaks about value from the perspective of an economist as applied to heritage. And one aspect of value that he speaks about is the concept of intergenerational equity. So you create something for the present generation, and then it's something that has value for succeeding generations. So again, you know, when there's a sweet spot with ICH and tourism, it creates intergenerational equity that it's sustained across generations, and that the economic benefit might not be totally immediate, but it will happen in future generations, and there'll be value there. But also wanted to say something, just I'll try and be very brief, about commoditization and commercialization. Anything, when it leaves a community context and enters the market economy, is a commodity. So I think that it's rather naive to say, well, we don't want to see commoditization. Commoditization is a dirty word. Musicians are involved in commoditization when they perform their music, even within local situations. Craftspeople make a living by creating their crafts, unless they're purely functional, and then it's within a community context, and it's not a commodity in being in the market economy. So I think we have to have a view of commoditization that accepts that anything that involves tourism is within the marketplace. And the question is, how is it done? And that, I think that also relates to the question of commercialization. Thanks.
Yeah, and just to add to that, that it is going to happen, but we're saying that the power balance should stay with the community, the practitioners, and how do we facilitate that to happen? And there's a really good resource, Heritage Intellectual Property and Marketing Strategies, that came out of India, with lots of resources for artists in terms of marketing better so that they get the returns, but also understanding intellectual property, how that affects them. And once it's in the digital realm, it's very hard to control, as we know, particularly now with AI. But trying to develop an ethical, principled way of putting the material out there. So you're saying, I'm going to share my stuff with you. I want you to buy it, but I want you to behave ethically with my images and my material when you're using it, to be aware. So it's that awareness raising about the responsibility and the ethics around that, so that you're empowering, or community and practitioners are more empowered to do that. And that was one of the key things around that cultural heritage for inclusive growth, around that empowerment, understanding, and the value of that product in the market, that we've seen for so many years of practitioners not receiving the value in terms of that transactional return. So looking at it in that broader context. And also there's the economic impact, but there's also many other impacts that can relate into a monetary saving. So social prescribing, when you prescribe culture for well-being and health, that is a saving. It's an economic saving within a government setup. So it's broadening out. But the monetary pound, when you're dealing with policy and tourism, tends to be the first starting point. So economic impact data, and then cutting it in terms of your tradition or your museum, is always, money always talks on that level, but it is much broader now. And it's money, following the money until you actually understand that the impacts and the outcomes of ICH do have that wider impact.
People in the tourist industry speak about heads and beds, and that's the bottom line, and that's what they want. They want to see more tourists, right? And heads and beds, lodgings and people coming to a place. And so, that's where you touch these ethical issues you're talking about, Joanne, because it's, when does it destroy the cultural integrity of a community, and when does it become too much, and when does it destroy the object of desire, when there's so many tourists that what's precious is lost.
Excellent, thank you. So you said heads and beds. Yeah, heads and beds for the accommodation, for the tour.
Heads in beds.
Yeah, heads.
IN, heads in beds.
Oh, heads in beds. Okay, no worries. Heads in beds. Thank you. Last question. We have with us, yes, please, last question. Do you want to give her the microphone? Please introduce yourself and ask a question. And after that, we are going to have a break.
네, 네, 감사합니다. 제가 사실 거의 토론할 때 와가지고 질문을 이제서야 드리는 점 양해 부탁드립니다. 저는 전주에서 무형문화재 선생님들의 공예품을 전시하거나 이제 기획하는 일을 하고 있는 프로미어의 설지희라고 하고요. 만나서 반갑습니다. 제가 드리고 싶은 질문은 사실 우리가 여기에 있는 이 전주 한옥마을에 관한 이야기입니다. 어제 제가 이제 전주 한옥마을이 어떻게 이제 발전되고 전개되었는지에 대해서 조금 듣게 되었는데요. 전주 한옥마을은 원래부터 한옥마을이었는데 이제 이게 조금 이제 자금 지자체의 어떤 지원이 들어가서 이 한옥마을의 정체성을 살리는 관광 지원들이 이제 적극적으로 이루어졌고 약 1,000억 원 정도의 어떤 정부 자금이 들어가서 2015년에는 한 1,000만 명이 달성되고 작년에는 1,500만 명의 관광객이 왔다고 합니다. 그럼에도 불구하고 지금 현재의 문제는 어떻게 보면 전주 시민들에게 그게 전혀 자부심이나 이점으로 오고 있진 않고요. 과거 평당 100만 원 정도 했던 비용이 젠트리피케이션으로 현재는 평당 4천만 원 정도에 이르러서 원주민들, 어떻게 보면 우리 무형유산의 자원이라 할 수 있는 사람들, 원주민들이 거의 다 떠난 마치 어제 어떤 방문하신 분은 마치 한옥의 세트장 같다라고 할 정도로 어떤 자원들이 이미 거의 다 떠나간 상태고 상업적인 피상적인 한옥이란 이미지를 피상적으로 소비만 하고 있는 상업지구의 역할을 하고 있는데요. 이미 이렇게 젠트리피케이션이 과잉이 된 상태에서 많은 어떤 원주민들이 떠나간 이 한옥마을에 저는 개인적으로 좀 더 뭔가를 할 수 있지 않을까 싶긴 한데요. 지자체에선 사실 이제 좀 회의적인 것도 있고 전주 시민들도 좀 회의적인 게 있습니다. 어떻게 보면 두 선생님께 여쭤보고 싶은 거는 지금 이런 과잉된 곳에 또 넥스트 스텝을 제시할 수 있다면 어떤 거를 제시할 수 있을까가 궁금합니다.
Well, I think that this question is so important that maybe we will start it with a round table that Professor Han is going to. Am I right? I mean, it's kind of beyond our session, is it? Or what do you think? I mean, I'm asking Professor Han Hee Ham, who is the real boss. Yeah. Should we start with this question in your session? Thank you so much for your question. It's a very perspicacious question and complex. Professor Ham agreed to start with this question in our next session, which is a round table, which is kind of a conclusion of this conference. So I would like to thank our wonderful, exquisite presenters all the way from Portugal/Scotland, Joanne Orr, and all the way from Paris, France, we have Séverine Cachat. Thank you so much.